sweep the roads as they rush down the falls. We know that together we are strong. Let us sing this song for the turning of the world, that we may turn as one. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along, and our lives will feel the echo of our turning. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along, and our lives will feel the echo of our turning. Let us sing this song for the healing of the world, that we may heal as one. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along, and our lives will feel the echo of our healing. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along, and our lives will feel the echo of our healing. Let us sing this song for the dreaming of the world, that we may dream as one. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along, and our lives will feel the echo of our dreaming. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along. With every voice, with every song, we will move this world along, and our lives will feel the echo of our dreaming.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I want to first, before I even introduce myself, say thank you to Rachel Chang for filling our hearts and this room and this sanctuary and our conversation with music. It's so important for us to feel alive as we have a conversation about the preciousness of life. My name is Menachem Creditor. It's my honor to serve as scholar in residence for UJA Federation of New York, and I also had founded a group called Rabbis Against Gun Violence, which leads me into many parts of this work. Does not make me an expert, but gives me the privilege of being present with two very important teachers that I'm about to introduce. I want to make sure that you know that your questions are going to also animate our conversation. And there are index cards that you've been handed. Karen, who's right here, will be one of the people collecting them. If you have questions along the way you'll be able to get them to us is please give them to Karen. She'll come around collecting soon. And I'm going to take a moment just to frame this Jewishly and then introduce our speakers on the panel. Really honored to have them here. I'm going to speak very briefly so that we get to the heart of the matter. But this is a first step for our Jewish community, not because it's the first time we as a Jewish community have paid attention, But this is the first time as UJA and JCRC together, we're going to have a very important conversation that is local. It is a New York conversation that we're going to have, but of course it's not limited to New York. And what I want to do is frame this as a time travel. Judaism had a lot to say about weapons because Judaism knew what it was to be powerless and to think about power. Now, as the world has changed and Jewish history has gone on, this has become more complicated because the use of weapons in defense of a family, in defense of a nation, that is one way of approaching a weapon. But in America, which is a different conversation than the Jewish frame, the Second Amendment really does complicate things, as does traveling through time and seeing what the idea about a musket does to a handgun. And our ability to truly have this conversation and to use faith as a springboard for participating, not standing in front as if only Jews know or as if Jews know more. That's just not the truth. But we are partners and members and part of society. We're told 2,000 years ago by the Mishnah, a collection of rabbinic writings during the time of Jesus and just after, that a Jew is called to seek the welfare of society without which neighbors would swallow each other whole. And that tells me that there really isn't a boundary that will protect me from the scourge, the epidemic of gun violence. Nor, if I only focus, and this is going to be part of our conversation, on statistics about gun violence without paying attention to the factors that influence what kind of gun violence, in what kind of community, what kind of weapon are we talking about, and what are the factors in society that contribute to the violence. So all I want to say is this. There's a teaching a little bit later than the Mishnah, 3 generations later, that says this. Anyone in whose family there is sin and doesn't say something about it is held liable for that sin. Anyone whose city contains sin and doesn't say something about it, they are liable for what happens in their city. Anyone who's in a world where sin happens and doesn't speak about it and do something about it is held liable, which is another way of saying love your neighbor as yourself. I want us to have this conversation without me quoting Talmud, but I want to make sure that the Jewish commitment is clear. A world that is vulnerable is a world that requires attention and commands. That's why we're here tonight. Central Synagogue is hosting this conversation. JCRC is making this conversation happen with UJA's support. And just before we begin, and just before I introduce everyone, I want to make note of the steering committee that made tonight happen. And I also want to start by recognizing Ben Golub, who is the president of JCRC, who's here with us tonight. Thank you for showing your commitment. The steering committee that helped plan this includes Emily Bogdan, who's right over there. So nice to see people in person. We have had so many meetings in other ways. And to those who are here remote, thank you for being here too. Karen Lafferty, who is also right over there. Thank you for your leadership. Louisa Chafee, who's a vice president at UJA, is in Israel on a mission right now. She has been instrumental as government liaison to helping this get off the ground. Karen Kasner, who is right here, is the reason on both sides of the equation that we made this happen. Thank you for this. Rabbi Bob Kaplan is right over there. He's my teacher and a dear friend, an incredible voice when it comes to justice in our world. Thank you for your leadership too. And Rachel Lissy, who's not here tonight, but is a wonderful part of our conversation. Thank you to her as well. Here we go. So this is a panel of experts with different experience, and I'm hopeful that we are just going to listen our ears off and open our hearts to what we hear and prepare with our bodies to do what we are guided to do. So I'm just going to read their full bios because they deserve that. Nah, they deserve it. They won't ask for it. But you worked for these resumes. So, starting with Natasha. In 2012, Natasha Christopher's beautiful son, Akiel, was taken from her in a senseless act of gun violence when he lost his life at the age of 15. Since then, Natasha has become a tireless advocate against gun violence. Natasha became a survivor outreach lead and fellow for Everytown for Gun Safety in 2015 and volunteered with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America 2014. This gave her the opportunity to meet other survivors and share her son's story on different platforms. After the tragic death of her son, Natasha got involved in the peer support group at the 67th Precinct Clergy Council Mothers Support Group. While being heavily involved in the group for 9 years, Natasha has transformed her pain into purpose by expanding the group to Mothers for Safe Cities while promoting healing and wellness. A year after her work with a mother support group, Natasha was empowered to create a nonprofit organization on her own called Achiel Christopher Community Center Corporation, in which she is the president. Her organization was founded to raise awareness on gun violence and gang violence, and also to promote youth relationship prevention programs, working closely with the New York City Police Department in promoting better relationships in all communities. In 2015, Natasha was proud to become a family outreach specialist for the 67th Precinct Clergy Council. Okay, it's a full resume and an important story. We don't leave any part out. Andrew's is a little bit shorter, but I'm gonna look at you with full respect too. Andrew Edelman is a senior research associate at Everytown for Gun Safety. His portfolio includes researching city gun violence prevention strategies and supporting legislative advocacy in the Western states. Previously, he was a policy and legislation graduate intern at the Office of the New York State Attorney General and research associate at the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice for New York City. He holds a bachelor's degree from Amherst College and a master's of public administration and public policy analysis from New York University's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Last but certainly not least, born and raised in Brooklyn. That's a big part of a resume. Andre T. Mitchell is the first ever New York City gun violence prevention czar and co-chair of the New York City Mayor's Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, appointed by Mayor Eric Adams, and the founder and executive director of Man Up, Incorporated, a community service organization dedicated to building a safer city through violence prevention, education, and employment. MUI represents a capstone of Mitchell's 30-plus year career in public service since being released from prison in 1991. Through Mitchell in 2009, MUI was one of the first organizations in New York to implement the Cure Violence model, now considered an integral part of evidence-based violence reduction in New York City and other urban communities. Mitchell is credited as co-architect of the New York City Crisis Management System, a systematic and comprehensive wraparound service model to reduce gun violence, which was established in 2010. For more than a decade, Mitchell voluntarily serves civically as an appointed community board member. Additionally, in 2014, he was elected the youngest honorable chair of Community Board 5 in East New York, Brooklyn, proudly serving the same neighborhood he grew up in with his single-parent mother, as well as his 7 brothers and sisters in public housing. Friends, even before I ask any questions, we recognize we are in the presence of people. That Mishnah quoted later says, in a place where there aren't people, stand up and be a person. We don't have that problem tonight. So what I'd love to do is stop talking and ask each of you to share with your voice why you do this work, what brought you, you're spending not just tonight, but your life on this. Natasha, I do want to start with you. I shared some of your story, but not in your voice. I'll hand you this microphone, please. The question is, what brought you into this work?
The reason I started doing this work, I wouldn't even be doing the work if my son wasn't murdered, right? I'm going to be honest. If my son was never murdered, I would never have done the work. I was working as a medical assistant, getting ready to go to school to be a nurse, and my life changed in a quick second. One night I received a phone call that my 14-year-old son at the time was shot in the back of his head. He survived for 14 days and died on his 15th birthday. I do the work because it gives me purpose. I love helping other people. So the reason I do the work is because I don't want what happened to me, because in the beginning, I had no help. And then I found help from people like Pastor Gill, Orisa Napa Williams, even A.T. Mitchell, because he has helped my other kids, right? So the reason, again, I do the work, because it gives me purpose to help others. Oh.
Is this on?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, well, first and foremost, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm honored to be in the presence of so many great people. And again, this is not usual for a Brooklynite boy from Brownsville in East New York, Brooklyn, to be here in Midtown. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Again, my name is A.T. Mitchell, and I am the executive director of a nonprofit community-based organization called Man Up Incorporated. We are now approaching our 19th year of being established. 19 years ago, unfortunately, on November 17th, 2003, we heard of a shooting of some children in East New York, Brooklyn. And so being a concerned citizen, a community activist at that time, I went into this particular crime scene and my heart was racing, and they said they took the children to the hospital, and when we got to Brookdale Hospital at that time, we met the family inside the emergency room, and luckily we learned that it wasn't a number of children shot, but just one child. He was 8 years old. His name is Deshaun Hill, and unfortunately, Deshaun had expired from his injury. He was accompanied by his little brother and baby sister. They were 5 and 4 years old. From that day forward, again, I felt like I was related to his children, and I felt like I had an obligation to do more. I was already active, but I didn't think even being active was enough, so I had to do more. And outside of that, I started volunteering myself and just really wanting to get to the root cause of the issues. And when I approach, community, and at first, to be honest with you, in a very vigilante sort of kind of aggressive way, because I was really just sick and tired of being sick and tired. I learned that these young people, and mostly who were on the streets, had the same reasons why they were on the streets that I did when I was a teenager and when I was a youth. And so the doors of the churches were closed. The community centers were not operating. There weren't anyone giving them any jobs. And so they were outside just trying to fend and trying to survive. And unfortunately, in the midst of all of that, they had some strife amongst each other, and a gun fight ensued. And Day, unfortunately, was the victim. It was actually, there was another victim. I want to call his name because he was part of that incident. He was 24 years old. His name is Michael Warren. So 2 young lives were cut short that one evening, 19 years ago. And so to date, our doors have been open and operating. We service young people as young as 5 years old and to older adulthood. And now we provide a plethora of different wraparound services in the community that range from, anywhere from after school to school-based programs to teen centers and athletic programs. I'm blessed to now say 19 years later that I have an array of community-based organizations and that I work alongside of, as been mentioned. Natasha and I are very much colleagues in this work, and it's a pleasure to meet my other panelists as well. And that's really what it is. I've just been dedicated to this issue. Nobody, in my opinion, is immune. As been heard, no one is safe amongst us. When gunfight erupts, we don't know whose name is on those bullets, until the smoke clears. And so I really want to get in front of it and try to, be the advocate that I am. And I believe that's why this mayor has looked upon me to be a partner in this fight. We've been partners for some time to help, really prevent gun violence from ever happening. And so that's really my focal point. Is how do we get in front of it versus, working in the intervention space.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to hear those 2 amazing stories is just incredible that you all are doing this work, and thank you both too. For me, it was a little bit less direct and a little bit less put upon me, but is maybe something that's more kind of what this community, the role this community can play too. When I graduated from school, I did not go directly into gun violence prevention. That's not what I was thinking. I did, I was a consultant for 2 years. But at the end of those 2 years, I was not feeling very motivated. I was feeling pretty negative. I was thinking, why am I in this? And knew that I wanted change. And, when I started thinking about what I wanted to be doing, I really drew inspiration from my Jewish roots, from my grandma, who showed me what it was to be involved in the community, showed me through taking people to the hospital when they were sick, and showed me through taking me to drive Meals on Wheels on Christmas Day, and that sort of thing too. but really it was the ethic of understanding that if there are people in your community who you can help, you know, you have an obligation to help them, like Rabbi was saying in his remarks too. So I started thinking about issues that were impacting my community, and growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, gun violence was a huge issue. Memphis consistently has some of the highest rates of gun violence in the country. And though I was lucky enough not to come face to face with any of that, it was something that I was always very aware of, the fact that a lot of people had guns and a lot of people were dying by those guns. And then moving to New York, which has not as high of rates, but still hundreds of people are dying every year from gun violence. It just struck me as an issue that was affecting the community that I was living in, and as something that I could do, you know, to take a step to make my community a better place. Yeah, that's kind of how I ended up where I am.
Thank you. So I want to focus on the panelists, but as a pivot, explain that the reason why I'm involved in gun violence prevention and have been for some time is because I came face to face with my ignorance on the issue. When Sandy Hook happened, I was a rabbi in Berkeley, California, and I was paying attention only when it was a mass shooting, and my heart broke, and I thought I knew what I was talking about. And the pastor across the street, who was a dear friend of mine, Pastor Michael McBride, invited me to join him to the White House in the immediate aftermath because he needed a Jewish partner to come, and there weren't any other Jews that he knew to invite. So he invited me, and I came, and I said, Michael, there aren't other rabbis. He said, oh, can you get Jews? And I said, Jews care. But that didn't mean I knew what I was talking about. It just meant I was willing and thought I knew something. We got there in the opening conversation, and this is going to lead into the next question that I ask, was a facilitator who mixed us up. And of the 90 faith leaders that were there, 9 of us were rabbis. Of the 90 faith leaders that were there were 9 white people, and those were the rabbis, which should tell you doesn't represent all the rabbis. Those are only the rabbis who are white. Right? So this is a very complicated, incomplete picture of the Jewish world and of the world. But as they circulated us, we mixed it up, and the facilitator said, share at the table the gun violence death that affected you most. And the rabbis, with one exception, my father, who lost a dear friend to gun violence, but the rabbis said, I don't have a story. And the pastors, and there was one imam in the room, the pastor said, you want me to choose one? And all of a sudden I realized I didn't know anything. And I showed up, which opened me up, but I still don't really know anything. And I showed up because I have to know, and I have to pay attention, even and especially when it hurts, because the blood of my sisters and brothers is calling out from the earth. So what I'm asking each of you in turn, Andrew, I'm going to start with you, is given your expertise, specifically in data and research, what do you know that we need to know? And we can focus on New York, but I want you to be the guide. What do most people just not understand about this issue that you can teach us?
Sure, and you know what I'm going to say is maybe not what most people don't understand, but it's what a lot of people who aren't directly impacted by gun violence may not understand, is that well over 99% of gun violence is not a mass shooting. It's not something that is happening and covered in your news with people coming to see what's happening. It's not something that is taking over. It's not necessarily like a Highland Park shooting. It's not necessarily Uvalde. It's happening in communities. Well over 99% of all gun violence, of the over 40,000 people who are killed every year, 110 people killed every day from gun violence, is not a mass shooting. It's happening in communities. It's happening through suicide, through domestic violence, through community violence. But I really think when people think about gun violence, who are people who are not living in it necessarily, living close to it, a lot of people perceive that mass shootings, they fear mass shootings, and because they're so random, because they happen in public, because it's so uncommon and random in a way. But most gun violence is not that, and that is not to say, and we need to care that the rest of that gun violence is happening in a serious way, and put our effort toward preventing that gun violence, just as much as people are putting their focus on the mass shootings that are happening too.
And as we move down the panel, I'm hopeful that you have questions that you've written down and you're going to circulate. Emily's in the back. You can hand her the index cards. If not, I've got plenty that I'm going to ask, but I'd like to give us the chance to have it as a conversation too. Natasha, please, again, the question that I'm asking, but feel free to answer the question that you want to answer, is what do we need to know that we don't know?
You know, for me, what I want people to know, because every young Black child, young man or young woman is not involved in a gang. Because after my son was shot, the first thing the police came to me, a traumatized mother, was asking me, is your son involved in a gang? My son wasn't involved in a gang, right? You know, I sent my son one summer, like he always do, to his grandmother's house and received a phone call. He was walking home, somebody shot into the crowd, and my son was shot. And I have a group of mothers, over like 100 mothers in my peer support group. And if you ask all of them the same question, they'll tell you the first question the police always ask us is your child involved in a gang? And every Black child is not involved in a gang. I am a single parent, was making sure that my son went to school. I attended parent-teacher conference. I put him in programs, and the one thing that I thought that would never happen to my son happened to him. So that's what I want people to know. You know, we are not raising gang members. They look at me, and that's the first thing they see, a young Black woman, and that's the first thing that they do is judge my children. I have 2 surviving children, and that's what they do. Before they have a conversation with my sons, they automatically make up their minds about who they are. And I have a son. My son is in college, and he works FedEx, and I have a son in high school who is an activist, who advocates against gun violence and plays basketball. So that's what I just want people to know. Before you make up your mind, have a conversation with someone.
So I would combine my answer with that has been said by my panelists, my fellow panelists, and that is, you know, the overwhelming majority of the shootings that we do learn about in today's media today, because it's more meteorized or covered or publicized, is not mass shootings, as my colleague has mentioned. And unfortunately, that's the ones that get the attention right now. It's sensationalized today, and it's unfortunate. Any shooting that happens is unfortunate, as we have heard this past week in different places around the country. But they do take place practically every day, and it happens in urban centers, a lot of times in communities of color. And in our neighborhoods, guess what? We didn't know that they were defined as mass shootings, because based on the definition, we've had mass shootings on a host of different regular occasions. We just never defined it as such. And so we had to learn on the curve as well, as it relates to the massive amount of shootings that is taking place in this country. And unfortunately, most of the communities are Black and brown. But as my other colleague has mentioned, for the sake of understanding and knowing, the overwhelming majority of our communities are good, forsaken people. They're God-fearing people. They're hardworking, tax-paying people, school-going people who want to grow up and just play and just live their lives to their fullest potential. There is a small minority of people, I think, in every community that may go against the rules of the day, you know, those that may differ from their teachings and upbringing. So like no other neighborhood, our communities, contrary to popular maybe belief, is good communities. Majority of our neighborhoods are good people. And we, like anyone else, we just want to be able to have a fair opportunity at life to be able to grow. I don't think also, lastly, that most people don't know that gun violence is a disease. You know, it is a disease. It is not a public safety issue. It's a public health issue. Because if you listen very carefully to my colleague, my comrade on my right, the type of trauma that she has to deal with and families have to deal with in communities after someone is shot, it's life, you know, ending. You can never recover. So the way that we I think as a society should see gun violence is as a public health crisis. That this is something that, in fact, if we do not try to get in front of and try to interrupt, nobody is safe. Nowhere, unfortunately, right? No one of us are safe because bullets don't know the religion of its victims. They don't know the skin, color or ethnic group of its religion or sexuality. It just does what it just is intended to do, right? And that is to tear away. And so we have to begin to frame our eyes and look at gun violence from a public health lens. The way that we treat it is from a public health approach that leads to public safety, and our communities, as been mentioned, those that have been unfortunately over, just been saturated with violence, these are traumatized communities. These are communities of people, young people and elders and others that are living in fear. And unfortunately, it's hard to recover from such experiences. And so I believe it's wiser that we see that no one is exempt, that we all have a part to play, and being able to interrupt it and hopefully eventually stop it so that it doesn't continue to wreak havoc on this earth.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to encourage everybody to take a breath. We're going to keep going. Just take a breath. It's good. So among the questions that you've submitted, and thank you for them, here's one that any one of you could answer, but I'm imagining the data is going to be important on this. These days, so much of the gun violence discussion seems to revolve around reducing or banning certain types or models of firearms. What kind of impact do you think that will have when millions or tens of millions are already in distribution and bad actors can simply use other types of models that are not restricted? Right, so the question is, just saying it's even more simply than that, if some guns are restricted, does that make things better?
It's been my experience, no, right, that it really doesn't, because the proliferation of guns that make its way throughout this country is just out of control, right? The amount of guns that are still manufactured in this country is just, it doesn't matter if, I think this country has some very tough gun control laws, and especially here in New York State, I believe has some of the toughest, they say. However, if those guns are still making their way into the crevices of the hands of, and unfortunately, of misguided people, and as mentioned, it still will have its effect, and so I think we have to look at this from both sides. I think we need a holistic approach to dealing with it. I'm not saying that gun control legislation and gun control advocacy is not important. It's very important. However, at the same time, we have to look at, the demand side, right? Why is it so accessible? In our communities, fortunately, the access to weaponry is easier for people to get a decent meal sometimes at the end of the day. Young people that I talked about earlier that are unable to get a job, but they are able to get their hands on a handgun. Now, these neighborhoods don't manufacture these guns, but they, for whatever reason, they've made their way into these communities, and it is unfortunate that, we have to deal with that accessibility. So I think it's a twofold thing, and I think that's something that we need to, also concentrate on.
Sure, yeah, I can add to that. I think it's a great point. Like we were all talking about earlier, most gun violence is not gun violence with an assault weapon. It's gun violence with a handgun. You look at a place like Canada that just prevented the purchase of handguns. Is that a more significant step that you can take? Probably. When you look at assault weapons in particular, we know that assault weapons make shootings deadlier. When an assault weapon is present, significantly more people die, significantly more people are wounded. So would it help in those situations to not have assault weapons? Yes. Are there other situations, is it going to solve gun violence? Of course not. Of course, the public health approach is a way to stop more gun violence than assault weapon, policies. But should we stop advocating for assault weapons, restrictions? I don't think we should. So I think like A.T. Mitchell is saying, it's all of these things. There's not one answer. There's not, we're not going to come up with one solution. There's not going to be one bill that's passed or one policy that's proposed that creates safety. It's about the communities. It's about communities as a whole. It's about people as a whole. And I think that assault weapons is a piece of that, but of course it's not the whole thing.
Okay.
I think my numbers are correct. In America, we have 329.5 million people and 400 million plus guns. And so the unfathomable dimensions of this question require such complicated strategies. It's so important to have the data-driven answer, but also the recognition that this is systemic. And I'm wondering on that level, so all three of you are dedicated in different ways to the systemic problem. So what would a more effective strategy be in your eyes? Not saying that working to ban assault rifles is wrong. It's not wrong. It's a good idea. It would save some. And some is one universe at a time, right? So everything is worthy. But what would the strategy that you would advocate on, let's start with New York, on a New York level entail to begin with? What's successful is maybe too utopian. What would be a smarter strategy to start with?
Go ahead.
Oh, you sure?
Yes, go ahead. You have the mayor's
Well, I think that maybe there's a smart approach to it is recognizing that, it is, like I said earlier, a disease, right? And so there are ways that we have actually known and learned of that from disease control experts, how to, reduce disease. We're coming out of a pandemic, right? And so we are learning a lot about how to stop, outbreaks and how to slow down on contagions. And I think if we look at it from the manner of, like again, I said earlier, a public health lens, we will find that it is maybe a better way to approach the reduction of shootings that are happening so regularly. And I say that because when you look at the data, you will see that there are communities that are unfortunately saturated and been devastated by this disease. And if these communities, I believe, are prioritized, you will do a deeper dive and realize that there are root causes to why people pick up guns in the first place and why people are using them on one another. And most of them have really no full understanding of what their actions are, the consequences to their actions are until it's too late. And when you look at it from that lens, you will find that there is poverty that exists, right, in this equation that gives birth to crime. And wherever there's poverty, there's going to be crime, because there's people who are trying to survive and trying to make way. And unfortunately, if that kind of community is stricken with poverty and you mix it with guns and drugs and all these other factors, then people are not in their right mind. You're dealing with mental illnesses and things of this nature now, where people and with undereducated schools are not going to necessarily see each other as human families, as people that live in a community. And they're, unfortunately, based on those ignorances, they're going to turn their frustrations on the closest people to them. And that's what we're witnessing. So I believe that if we look at it from a public health approach, we take what we know works based on the evidence. As you mentioned, I'm very familiar with the model, the Cure Violence Global model, which derived out of the city of Chicago. It was founded by an epidemiologist. His name is Dr. Gary Sluckin. And his approach made a whole lot of sense when he correlated disease outbreaks to violence outbreaks, and how we get in front of it and interrupt it was very masterful of him. And it's been working not just in Chicago, and this is all data driven. There's a ton of evaluations out there now, even here in New York, that's been done by John Jay College, that shows the reduction if this model is applied according to the fidelity. So there are ways. And interestingly enough, once violence is reduced, then people have better relationships with their neighbors. You know, once people are able to feel see their hand in front of their face, they're able to recognize the fact that others also exist and that we need to work together to keep, you know, a community safe.
As a survivor, right, I see it as, for me, I see it as like A.T. Mitchell said, we see it, and me and my survivors, we see it as a disease, right? I didn't know until my son was murdered that the lack of resources the Black and brown community was receiving. Like there wasn't enough community centers, there wasn't enough safe place for young people to go and feel safe. So most of the time, I'm sitting right here and I tell people all the time, yes, I'm sitting here and having a conversation with you guys, but I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe. 10 years later, I still don't feel safe. I live with trauma every single day, but I do get help for it, but I don't feel safe. America, for me, is the only place that deals with gun violence on an everyday basis. No other country is dealing with gun violence like this. So I don't know what we're going to do. I just know that I am not prepared, and I pray to God every night that this doesn't happen to me or touches my family again. So I know that we all have to just come together and work together. And like A.T. Mitchell said, gun violence doesn't know color. It could be me today, you tomorrow. So we all have to come together and unite and do a better job to end gun violence.
Sure. I mean, the only thing I would really add to what both of you all said is that if you take a map of New York City and you look at a map of where are the shootings happening, and then you look at a map of where has redlining happened, and then you look at a map of high school graduation rates, and you look at a map of poverty, you're looking at the same map. It's not changing. It's the same thing over and over. These are all related issues, and they're all causal of each other. You know, it's a circular story, and unless we go about investing in schools, there are 77 precincts or something like that in New York. Half of all shootings happen in 14 of them. If we go about investing in schools in those places, investing in hospitals, investing in community centers, that is what is going to make a difference in the long term and the short term, as opposed to, other strategies.
Thank you for all of that. Now, I want to broaden the conversation while not leaving anything behind that you've just shared. One of the reasons that the Jewish community has had such a complicated relationship with the conversation about violence is because of particular Jewish history and particular Jewish vulnerability, which might not show, but is very deeply felt. It's inherited, and with a rise in anti-Semitism, measurable, and violence accompanying the anti-Semitism, not just rhetoric, but actual acts of violence, including some terrible massacres recently. It's an act of courage to have the conversation in a Jewish space, which doesn't compare trauma to trauma, it just means this is hard. And so I'm wondering, with that sensitivity, we're in a really complicated American moment, and I pray that we are learning how to listen and talk to each other again. If I pay attention to the news too much, I'm not so sure that we are. But if we can be a model for compassionate and passionate thinking, I'm wondering if there's a way, there's a question that someone brought in that fits into this frame, how can we frame the issue for both sides of the political spectrum? And Natasha, I think you have already, but I'm wondering if we can think about it so that as we try to do whatever we can to really make a difference, can you help us find language to move the conversation forward? So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about framing this issue so that advocating for health doesn't feel like a threat to anybody else. I know. Popcorn, whoever wants it.
Sure. I mean, everyone deserves to be safe.
Yeah.
everyone deserves to be safe. You're walking down the street, you're in your own house, you're going on a trip, you're in the airport, you're in the synagogue, wherever you are, you deserve to be safe. You know, my next thing that I would say is that the presence of a gun makes you less safe. But, you know, if you start with that framework, you can at least have that conversation. If you start with the framework of, I think you deserve to be safe, and I think I deserve to be safe. Now you're relating, now you're having a conversation with someone, you know, and you've started with something that you agree on.
So I'm going to stick with you for a second, because having tried that, and it is language that I think is very true. The response often from someone who, you know, isn't a member of my Facebook group or whatever, is you want to take it away from me. So you say you want to be safe, but I don't feel safe. You're going to come take away my gun. So I'm just like, let's follow up with that for a second in a calm space. And it doesn't have to be you, Andrew, but how do we respond to that fear? Because that's coming from fear too.
So my thing is, do you really need a gun to feel safe? Having a gun does not really make you safe, right? So that's my thing. I just want to feel safe, and I just don't feel safe. I don't think giving me a gun is going to make me feel any safer. I think if you put a gun in my hand, it's just going to make me want to hurt somebody with all the trauma that I'm dealing with, right? But my thing is, everybody wants to feel safe. You want to feel safe. I want to feel safe. I want everybody in the world to feel safe. And right now, this country does not feel like a safe space for anybody to be in. So I'm just praying and hoping that God just wash away all this trauma and give people the light to see that if we all work together, I believe that we can end gun violence.
That's a prayer worthy of an amen first. Amen. Amen. That's a prayer.
As it relates to language, I think, you know, how about all lives matter?
Yes.
Right? Not Black lives matter or white lives matter. How about all lives matter? Right? And when we look at this from a humane perspective, you know, humanity, you know, there's some that has been said, you know, when those that say we're going, you know, that there's gun control laws that feel like there's a huge other side of the aisle of people who are saying, well, you're not going to take away my gun and my right to bear arms, right? Because as a result of such, they have also rights and they have an opinion, as long as they, you know, understand that everybody lives matter. You know, and if we look at it from a perspective from a humanities perspective, I think, you know, no matter, you know, how we frame it, it will encompass the understanding that we all have a right to feel safe. You know, no matter if it's me or if it's any one of you, we should be able to walk throughout the city, you know, ride the subway or wherever we were going to or fro, whether it's to, you know, to worship or whether it's to play. We should not have to worry or feel like, you know, unsafe. And in certain neighborhoods, and the way that it is, and unfortunate based on a lot of the data, it appears like there's certain lives that matter versus or over the other. And it shouldn't be the case. All lives matter, no matter if it's a Sandy Hook mass shooting, you know, or if it's a shooting that's happening in Brownsville. You know, we should have a concern. We should feel, you know, sympathetic about the loss of life, you know, before a person's time. And I think that's the way that we should look at it from that lens.
Thank you. One of the questions that came in our planning, we learned a lot of data. Rabbi Kaplan has been really important for me in terms of finding data and sharing it, very current research. And one of the talking points, it seems, in the media associated with gun violence is mental health. And I'm wondering if you can guide us, how do we respond? This is the way the questioner wrote it. How do we respond to those who define the issue as a mental health issue, not an issue of the wide and easy availability of guns? So how do we respond to that?
I think, again, when you even speak of or hear the concept of mental health, you're going back into the public health. That's public health language, right? And so when you look at it from that perspective, again, we need to really take a look at it from a public health lens. When people are not stable, when people needs are not being met, you know, they just unfortunately go into certain dark spaces or places in their mind, and they think irrationally, and they're not thinking, the way that they should. And then there are some people who may have real serious mental sicknesses, and they're really suffering, and they need not to be incarcerated, but they need to be, treated from medical institutions and medical doctors, and to see how we can be able to assist these individuals. And so, mental health, I mean, when you think about the traumatization that has been upon all of us as a people, and the fact that people, are trying to still go back to some form or sense of normalcy, that in itself, it is mind-boggling. It really is. It really does send people, when we're walking around with loss of life, and when the holidays come around, as they are now, it really makes people think irrational, and people are not in their right minds. And so, again, if we look at this from a perspective of it being a pandemic, gun violence being something that is a public health crisis, then we can associate the mental health in there, and we can toss in that and understand that if we go in there with the type of approaches that address mental health, we're also, at the same time, we're addressing to deal with the public health concerns, like gun violence.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that, these issues can exist together, right? We don't need to separate the issues of mental health and access to guns, and to add to that, people who, suffer from mental health disabilities are significantly more likely to be killed by the police. Police gun violence is gun violence. I think that these issues can all exist in the same conversation and don't need to be pushing against each other, right? We can talk about how people should have less access to guns. People should have a harder time buying a gun than getting an easy meal. And we can talk about how the people who have mental health disorders should have, health support from the correct responders in the situation that, if they need help, they're getting help. And we can talk about the fact that somebody who maybe shouldn't have a gun shouldn't get a gun because, they don't have, the ability to safely own a gun. Those three things can all happen. We can talk about all those in the same conversation, hold those all together, and we don't need to separate it into access to gun versus mental health versus police, gun violence. Those all can coexist in our conversation together.
Thank you for that. And to introduce, I think it's on the sheet that Andrew brought some statistics that I think you might have in your hands. I think it said 53% of the gun violence deaths nationally are by suicide. And in New York, the percentage was different than that, right?
I have to look myself.
Yeah,
in New York, 53% of gun deaths are suicide.
53. And so the conversation is always more complicated than a simple solution might present. So given some of those concerns, I have one or two more questions I'll be asking, and then I'm going to invite Rabbi Haber to give us a blessing on the way out. And all the while, I'm just overwhelmed to be in your presences. So there's a question here, where should someone go if they hear of another's plan to use a gun? For those who weren't paying attention, there was a story that happened within the Jewish community. A terrible massacre had been planned and was intervened because someone found on Twitter, and because of the safety mechanisms that we're trying to put in place, one attack, thank God, was averted. But that was one. So where should someone go if they hear of another's plan to use a gun? How do they report it so that innocent people are not targeted or labeled unfairly? Can this information initiate an effective crisis response, preventing harm to the individual and community?
I think that, honestly, if it's in that context, you have to report that to the police, right? Whenever there is that sort of threat that someone may have a gun or intend to use a gun, then that's where the police is necessary, and they are more trained in knowing how to approach that situation versus any other profession. And so I think when it relates to somewhat with mental illness, if it's emotionally disturbed individual, and there's no report of any weapons or gun, then the proper responders shouldn't have to be the police, right? They don't have to be the first responders to deal with that kind of situation. But if there is the talk of a gun on a person, you cannot not call the police. You should definitely call the police, and that's they are trained to know how to respond to those type of situations. Unfortunately, they're not trained to know how to deal with the mental health and with folks in neighborhoods that are dealing with other traumas, and that's what becomes sometimes the problem. I think the police sometimes get an unfair deal. They're kind of tossed at everything, like they are our go-to people, when in fact they're not really the experts in a lot of these areas in these situations that they respond to, and it's unfair to them. And if everybody understood their role, if they understood exactly how we assess a situation and have the proper response to it, I think we have a lot more positive outcomes versus some of the things that we hear about in our news.
Yeah, and I think the fact that Natasha and I are sitting here looking at each other like, I don't know. That's a problem, right? Like, that's a problem. We should know. Yeah. There should be an answer to that question. Unfortunately, it's complicated, and it's an issue, and that's part of understanding gun violence as a holistic public health problem, is understanding it's not simple. It's complicated, and we're not going to simplify it by coming up with one answer. We're going to embrace the complexity of it and try to solve it at that level.
Thank you.
If you see someone with a gun, do call the police. Okay, don't take nothing into your own hands. Absolutely. Call the police. That's what I would do.
Thank you for that. Look, I want in that spirit to let us all know that we're going to be having, please God, March, sorry, I want to get the date right, May 3rd or 4th, we're going to figure out the specifics, a bigger conversation, a gun violence prevention conference. We're hoping that we'll be able to deepen the conversations, really explore, please God, learn from the three of you again and others who have a lot to teach. We'll be sharing this information with you. You registered for this. You'll hear about it first. But we hope that this is only the first step. We've been really trying to do this methodically, to learn what we can, to ask the questions one at a time and try to retain all the wisdom that we gain. And to quote Anais Mitchell, who wrote Hadestown, she put this into the play, it's a sad song, but we tell it anyway. Right, these are stories that we need to continue telling, knowledge we need to continue gaining until, please God, it doesn't make any sense anymore. Right, so that's what we're praying for. So in that spirit, I'd love to welcome Rabbi Hilly Haber to bless us. And as she does, this has been such an important conversation. You've taken time on a cold winter day, right, with lots of other things that probably we'd rather be thinking about, to commit ourselves to one more step towards justice. So thank you for being part of this conversation. Thank you to JCRC and UJA and Central Synagogue for making sure that we could be here. To AT, to Natasha, and to Andrew, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. And on behalf of the Central community, it's such an honor for us to be able to host this conversation. And to AT, Natasha, Andrew, and Rabbi Creditor, thank you for taking the time to share your stories, to share your talent, to share your expertise in this issue. I feel like you've moved me from a little bit of despair to more hope, a little bit of paralysis to more empowerment. And I'm grateful to you for lending your time and for giving us that information and your expertise today. And thank you, Rabbi Creditor, for leading us in this conversation. And to JCRC and UJA for putting this together. And for everyone who's watching on Zoom and for everyone who's here. It's such an honor to be here and really grateful for this first step in what will be a larger conversation within the Jewish community about gun violence. And as we leave here tonight, may we see this issue through a holistic lens. Maybe you understand the overlapping issues of public health, of economic injustice, of mass incarceration that affect this issue, of poverty, of unequal access to education in our city. May we think about this solutions to gun violence through multiple pathways, holding multiple truths. May we be both patient and urgent in our response, and passionate and compassionate in our solutions. So thank you all so much for being here, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.